Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. A few years ago, I started working as a flight attendant for a small airline based in San Diego, California. It was my first real job, and I was full of excitement. The company mainly handled short flights along the West Coast, connecting cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. It seemed like the perfect job for someone like me, fresh out of training and eager to see new places. At first, everything went normally. My shifts were usually on morning flights, which meant early wake-ups, but also the advantage of having afternoons free. I lived alone in a cozy apartment near Mission Valley. My routine settled in quickly, waking up early, hectic work days, and quiet nights at home, relaxing before going to bed early for the next day. However, about a month after I started, something began to feel strange. At first, it was subtle. I noticed a passenger, a man in his mid-30s named Jonathan, as I later found out, who showed up on several of my flights. He was quiet, always polite, and nothing about his behavior seemed alarming at first. It was common to see frequent flyers, especially on such short routes, so at first, I didn't think much of it. But when I saw him for the fourth time in less than 2 weeks, always on my same flights, an uneasiness began to settle in me. Every time he boarded, he would smile politely, greet me, and then sit there silently watching me from his seat. There was nothing openly threatening in his gaze, but there was something about it that unsettled me, almost too familiar. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. After all, dealing with passengers was part of the job. Still, his presence soon stopped feeling like a coincidence. On a flight from San Diego to Seattle, halfway through the trip, I saw him lift his phone and take a photo, aimed directly at me. When our eyes met, he calmly lowered the phone, smiled, and looked away. The next day, on a different flight, I made a point not to look at him, but as I served drinks, I noticed he was watching me constantly. Every time he realized I'd caught him, he would quickly look away. Everything felt calculated, as if he were testing my limits. The discomfort grew inside me. I still hadn't told anyone, not my fellow crew members, not my friends, not my family. Part of me felt embarrassed. Maybe I was overreacting. It wasn't unusual for flight attendants to receive unwanted attention from time to time. But there was something about Jonathan that felt different to me, something coldly intentional. The breaking point came a week later, during an overnight layover in Portland. It had been an exhausting day with several flights in a row, and I just wanted to rest at the hotel. I was staying at the downtown Marriott, and I decided to walk to a nearby cafe for dinner. When I stepped out of the hotel and looked across the street, I froze. Jonathan was there, standing under a street lamp as if waiting for someone. My heart started pounding. Maybe it was a coincidence, I thought. Maybe he was traveling for business. But then I remembered he had been on my flight earlier that day. Was he following me? Trying to stay calm, I crossed the street in the opposite direction and walked quickly toward the cafe, praying he hadn't seen me. Inside, I chose a table far from the windows and couldn't stop nervously looking outside. Halfway through my meal, I heard the door open and felt my stomach tighten. Jonathan had walked in. He didn't approach me. He simply ordered a coffee, sat at the counter and glanced at me, barely nodding his head. My appetite vanished instantly. I paid quickly, left the cafe, and hurried back to the hotel, constantly looking around me. Thankfully, I didn't see him again that night, but sleeping was almost impossible. By that point, his behavior had clearly crossed the line. I considered reporting him to the airline, but I still hesitated. He hadn't threatened me directly or done anything I could prove was illegal. Even so, fear began to take over my daily routine. On every flight, I scanned passengers' faces again and again, dreading that I would find his. A few weeks passed with no sign of him, and little by little I started to relax, convincing myself it had all been in my imagination. But one night, on a late flight from Los Angeles to San Diego, I saw him again. He was sitting in the first row, right beside the service area. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Throughout the short flight, Jonathan didn't take his eyes off me. This time he didn't hide it. He wanted me to know he was there, that he wasn't going away. When we landed, I waited until all the passengers got off before leaving, trying to avoid any interaction with him. But he stayed in his seat until the very end, deliberately taking his time. As he passed by me, he leaned in slightly and said in a low voice, "Have a good night. We'll see each other soon." His words sounded harmless, but the tone and intention behind them sent a chill through my blood. I stood frozen, my heart racing. It was in that moment that I realized I couldn't keep ignoring the situation. The next day, I informed my supervisor and told her everything that had happened. Airline security and the local police got involved, although they told me they couldn't do much without concrete evidence or explicit threats. Jonathan hadn't committed a clear crime. The company decided to change my schedule and temporarily suspend my flights, hoping the distance would discourage him. At first, it seemed to work. Weeks of calm passed, and I began to feel something close to normal again. But one night, when I returned to my apartment with groceries, I noticed a folded piece of paper slipped under my door. Trembling, I opened it. Inside was a single neatly printed sentence. "You shouldn't have told anyone." My hand started shaking as I processed what that meant. He knew exactly where I lived. I called the police immediately and showed them the note. They investigated, reviewed the security cameras, but didn't find clear footage of anyone suspicious. Once again, there was no proof, only fear. In the end, I had no choice but to move, change my phone number, and request a transfer within the airline. Over time, I tried to rebuild a sense of safety, though the experience left its mark on me. Even today, I still find myself looking over my shoulder when I walk alone, always alert, always cautious. Jonathan never appeared again, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, waiting patiently. Before continuing with the next story, if this is your first time visiting our channel, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next horror stories. Story 2. Last winter, my aunt and uncle came to visit me in Atlanta. We spent hours talking about the usual family topics. At some point in that long conversation, we ended up talking about strange events. My uncle is not a man prone to fantastical stories, so when he said he carried a memory that would never leave his mind until the day he died, I opened my laptop and started typing. He nodded, gave a slight smile, and asked me to warn whoever read this that these are only the words of an old man, and that some parts might seem impossible. He began by telling me that he finished his studies at the University of Fordham in 1974. Back then, getting a good job was easy. Companies sent letters and even called newly graduated students to offer them positions. But he didn't want to spend his life trapped behind a desk, so he waited for an opportunity that would make him feel like he belonged there. That moment came during a Thanksgiving flight to visit my aunt. As he looked out the window at the tiny lights of planes crossing the night sky, he fell in love with the idea of air traffic control. The steady voices over the radio, the moving lights, everything about that ordered, vibrant world fascinated him. By the time he turned 27, he had passed all the exams and was allowed to work without direct supervision. However, beginners couldn't choose their first destination. Instead of a famous airport like John F. Kennedy or Hartsfield-Jackson, he was assigned to one called Atlantic, in Iowa. Many people confuse Atlantic with the ocean, but it's actually a small farming town. The airport had a single short runway surrounded by endless rows of corn. The daytime workers left at 5 in the afternoon, but the tower had to stay open until 4 in the morning. Overhead, multiple air routes crossed, so any damaged plane could be forced to land there in an emergency. My uncle spent nights alone in the tower's glass cabin, while a guard named Joe slept downstairs, next to the empty ticket counters. Most hours passed in silence. He killed time reading thick novels and doing crossword puzzles. He also spoke on the phone, in a low voice, with my aunt. People often say air traffic control destroys your nerves, but in Atlantic, he was almost always bored. Only once in a while would some small Cessna request permission to land in the dark. That quiet routine went undisturbed until mid-February of 1979. On February 20th, the wind was blowing hard across the fields, though there was no snow. He had the closing shift, and since there were no scheduled flights, he expected another night of monotony. At 1 in the morning, a small Cessna called over the radio from about 20 miles north. A strong storm over Omaha forced the pilot to look for a safe runway. My uncle grabbed the binoculars, checked visibility, and began guiding him in for landing. The descent was difficult because of the crosswind, but the wheels touched down without problems. He raised the binoculars once more to make sure everything was fine and went cold. A woman was walking on the runway. She wore a thin summer dress with no coat or shoes, as if the air were warm, but the temperature was below zero. Worse still, no one could explain how she had gotten to the middle of an active runway. Confused, my uncle took the microphone and called the Cessna. "Do you see a woman on the runway?" he asked. The pilot responded, surprised but calm, got out of the plane and approached her. Through the binoculars, my uncle watched him speak to her. She tilted her head and brought her lips to his ear. They stayed like that for 10 eternal seconds, motionless. Suddenly, the pilot straightened up, turned, and ran back to the plane. The propeller started spinning. My uncle shouted over the radio, ordering him to wait, but the man didn't respond. The small plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the night. A static buzz filled the radio. Through the noise, my uncle caught a few scattered words and then one clear phrase: "Run." The signal cut off. Still trying to understand what had happened, he remembered the woman. When he looked back through the binoculars, she was standing there, staring directly at the tower from about 200 yards away. Her eyes were so wide they looked painful. With no single snowprint beneath her feet, she began to run toward him. My uncle had survived 6 years in Vietnam, and he believed fear no longer had power over him, but that figure running through the dark froze his soul. He called for the guard, "Joe," but there was no answer. He looked down just in time to see the tower door burst open. Instinct drove him to the small bathroom beside the radar. He locked himself inside. Outside, chaos exploded, pounding, furniture crashing, hurried footsteps. At one point, something struck the door with such force that the doorknob shook. Then absolute silence. He stayed hidden until the orange light of dawn slipped under the door. At 7:45, the day shift controller, Clark, arrived and freed him. The control room was a wreck, radio panels ripped out, screens shattered, papers all over the floor. The police took statements, but nothing made sense. The tower stayed closed for repairs for 11 days. Joe was fired for sleeping on duty. There was talk of installing cameras, but it was postponed. My uncle tried to convince himself it had all been the work of a mentally unstable woman from the nearby town. Over time, the story blurred between reason and nightmare. He returned to his post on March 4th. The nights passed peacefully for what remained of winter, but one afternoon, near the end of another shift, a private jet requested landing due to severe turbulence and ice buildup. It was much larger than the planes they usually received, but emergencies break the rules. As he watched snow fall through the tower windows, she appeared again. She emerged at the far end of the runway, barefoot, with the same thin dress fluttering among the flakes. Her face was turned toward him, eyes wide, fixed, unblinking. He remembered then that the first time, she hadn't blinked even once. He ordered the jet to hold altitude, but the pilot refused. They couldn't keep flying in those conditions. He gave clearance, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing the woman was already less than 100 feet from the tower door. He ran down the stairs and locked the exterior bolt, then returned to his console. He looked out the window. The runway was empty. Maybe she had left. The jet announced final approach. At that instant, something slammed into the lower door. Metal screeched. Hearing anything else was impossible. Heavy footsteps began climbing the metal stairs, each step echoing with fury, as if someone were deliberately stomping the rungs. He kept his voice steady and cleared the landing. Behind him, the office door opened slowly. He wanted to run, but his body didn't respond. He felt cold breath brush his neck, and then an icy whisper, "Go down to the field." It wasn't a scream, but the contained rage in that tone froze the air. The jet touched down and began taxiing along the runway. The breath vanished. The footsteps moved away, first fast, then in silence. When he turned around, the doorway was empty. Along with the guard, they searched every corner of the tower, the runway, and the nearby fields. The officers found a single line of barefoot footprints leading from the cornfield to the tower. None led back. Fear consumed him, but he couldn't prove anything. Convinced the woman was real, though inexplicable, he decided to stay silent about certain details. Spring arrived early. By April, the field was covered in green. He thought the horror had died with winter, but on a warm April night, a cargo plane reported engine trouble. My uncle helped guide it in until something on the asphalt caught his attention. Under the yellow light, she was there again. Gray skin, a dress torn to rags, hair stuck to her face even though it wasn't raining. A tanker truck driver saw her, and when she whispered something in his ear, the man fled in terror, honking the horn until he vanished into the fields. My uncle called the new guard, but he was inspecting the fence. Alone, he heard the exterior iron steps vibrate. She was climbing, barefoot. Each metallic step rang out like a clock from hell. The cargo pilot begged for instructions. My uncle, trembling, kept giving coordinates while watching the ceiling, where the upper hatch was beginning to open. The wind came in, icy. First her head appeared, tilted, her eyes even wider than before. She climbed over the edge, bluish skin, her gaze fixed on him. She didn't look at the instruments or the lights. She only looked at him. The plane roared as it landed, making the glass vibrate. She flinched, turned him, and walked toward the other window. She stepped onto broken glass. Blood left small circles, but she showed no pain. She climbed onto the ledge and threw herself into the void. When officers and paramedics arrived, they searched below. There was no body, no blood, no drag marks. Only the droplets inside the room confirmed she had truly been there. They tried to clean the stains, but they never disappeared. The paint couldn't cover them. They always surfaced again. My uncle ended his story by saying he stayed at that airport 6 more months before transferring to Idaho. He never saw the woman again. However, on sleepless nights, he still hears the metallic echo of bare feet climbing stairs and feels an icy breath brush his skin. He wonders whether that figure was flesh and blood or something much older. A presence that used a human shape only to get close to those who watched from a certain glass tower, lost in a cornfield. He doesn't know, and he never will. But every winter, when the cold returns to the Midwest, he opens the local newspaper and looks for strange news from small towns. So far, he has never found anything, and that silence torments him even more. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers together, and stared at the floor, letting the last words hang in the room. My aunt touched his shoulder and told him the coffee had gone cold, though he didn't seem to notice. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and without ever having been there, I felt the weight of a night in Iowa that seemed far too real. My uncle has lived a full life, but when he remembers those hours in the tower, his voice still trembles like the static of a radio lost over a frozen runway. Story 3. I hadn't flown in years, but my grandson insisted I attend his university graduation in Miami. He He got me the cheapest ticket on a red-eye flight, United 1658, leaving San Francisco at 11:55 p.m. and landing a little after 8 the next morning. I'm 69 and I walk with a cane, so the gate agent, very kindly, allowed me to board early. Row 14 was halfway down the cabin on the right side. My seat was 14B, aisle. On the boarding screen, the window seat 14A appeared unassigned. An empty seat beside me felt like a small gift. I stowed my purse, settled my coat over my knees, and listened to the slow river of passengers sliding toward the back. Most of them looked tired. Hoodies, headphones, little cups of coffee trembling in nervous hands. Just when it seemed the boarding was ending, a man stopped beside my row. He didn't hesitate or check his boarding pass. He turned sideways, slid into 14A, and sat down. I felt the weight of a wool coat brush my sleeve. He kept his head lowered, his chin tucked into a gray scarf. No carry-on, no drink. He crossed his hands over his lap, pale fingers over black gloves. I decided to be polite. "Long night," I whispered. He didn't move. I tried again. "Miami is warmer than this." Nothing. I let out a brief laugh, more for myself than for him, and looked toward the aisle. The cabin lights dimmed for takeoff. I expected him to fasten his seatbelt, but his was already secured. Maybe he had done it before I noticed. During the climb, the plane vibrated the way planes do, like a bus on a gravel road. My seatmate didn't flinch. Shoulders set, posture too rigid for someone planning to sleep. I watched the yellow seatbelt sign reflected in the dull fibers of his coat. Each strand looked damp, almost tacky, as if he had walked through a drizzle. An hour later, the flight attendants began their quiet service. The cart rolled down the aisle offering water and pretzels. When the attendant reached our row, she leaned toward me. "Something to drink?" I took a ginger ale. Then she looked at the window seat with a puzzled expression. "And for him?" "He hasn't said a word," I whispered. She leaned closer to the man. "Sir?" No response. She waited the appropriate amount of time and left a small bottle of water on his tray, untouched. The cart moved on. I drank my ginger ale. The bubbles stung at the back of my throat. I noticed the man's gloves. The leather gave back no shine from the cabin, as if they absorbed a light. His breathing didn't fog the thin air around him. I must have fallen asleep, because I woke in darkness except for the glowing aisle markers and the faint spill of a movie 3 rows ahead. My watch read 3:07 a.m. My neck was stiff. I stretched a little and felt the sleeve of the man's coat pressing against my arm again, as if he had leaned toward me while I slept. The pressure was steady, not the accidental touch of turbulence. "Sir, could you give me a little space?" I said. Nothing. I pressed the call button. Nothing happened. Maybe the bulb was burned out. Instead of waiting, I decided to use the restroom. I stood carefully, stepped into the aisle, and made my way toward the rear galley. Behind me, the man didn't move. The bathroom line was short, 2 teenagers and an executive. I looked down the aisle. From that angle, 14A looked empty. Only the bare headrest caught the blue light. I frowned, tilted my head, narrowed my eyes. Still empty. A cold thought ran through me. Maybe he had followed me, but I hadn't heard footsteps. When I returned, 14A was occupied again by the same motionless silhouette. I slid into 14B, my heart pounding like knocks on a door. I tried to rest, but I stayed listening for him to breathe. I heard nothing, only the constant hum of the engines and now and then, the clink of glasses in first class. With dawn, a pink edge appeared through the window on the other side. The cabin lights rose. The lead attendant announced we would begin our descent and asked everyone to straighten their seats. The man beside me remained rigid. I focused on small tasks, folding my blanket, aligning my purse strap until the landing gear struck the runway. We landed at 8:11 a.m., taxiing past Florida's bright grass. Passengers unbuckled, stood up, stretched, gathered their things. I waited for help getting up with my cane. When I finally stood, the man was still seated, hands folded, gaze down. I touched his sleeve, intending to say goodbye or, at the very least, ask permission to pass. The wool was colder than the window glass. I squeezed by and stepped out. Already in the jet bridge, a young attendant hurried up, almost out of breath. "Ma'am, were you in 14B?" "Yes." "Was there anyone in the window seat?" I hesitated. "A man in a gray coat." She frowned. "Our manifest shows 14A empty. There shouldn't have been anyone there." "He was there all night." Another attendant joined her with a tablet in hand. She scrolled, frowned, looked up. "The boarding count matches. All assigned seats occupied, no extras." I felt dizzy. Maybe a last-minute standby. They exchanged looks. "The gate records don't show anything." One of them gently guided me to a chair while the other went back onto the plane. A minute later, she returned, pale. "The seat is empty. The seat belts are crossed." I insisted they check the cameras. They promised they would. I left unsettled, searching for explanations. Exhaustion, dim lighting, my aging eyes. At my son's house, I told the story. He half smiled, with a hint of concern, and asked if I had any proof. Then I remembered the photo. During boarding, I had taken a quick picture of the cabin to send to my daughter, a silly joke about traveling alone. I opened my gallery. Row 14 glowed on the screen. My two seats, mine, and the window seat empty. No gray coat, no gloved hands. And yet, the memory of that rough fabric against my arm was as real as the phone in my palm. I could still feel the weight of the coat, smell that damp wool stink. I spent the day with the family, trying to enjoy the celebration. But night brought uneasy thoughts. In the guest bed, I replayed every moment. The boarding, the silent man, the unopened bottle of water. I wondered if there are people who travel in another way, slipping between counts and camera frames, needing only a seat, and the warmth of another body nearby. Maybe he didn't mean harm. Maybe he was only looking for company on a long, cold flight. The next morning, curiosity overcame fear. I called United Customer Service. After 3 transfers, a supervisor answered. I asked if the crew had found any belongings in 14A. A wallet, a boarding stub, anything. She said cleaning reported only a sealed bottle of water. Then she asked if I was the woman who had filed the incident note upon arrival. I said yes. She paused and lowered her voice. The flight deck reviewed the passenger list and the boarding security footage. There's no record of anyone occupying that seat. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from cold. I opened my address book and found my late husband's number, still saved even though he died 3 years ago. I dialed it knowing it would lead nowhere, wanting to hear the automatic message, to fill the room with a voice, even if it was recorded. Outside, distant traffic hummed like airplane engines.